Excellent. So now I'm recording, and I'll go back to our first slide. And I'd like to welcome everyone. This is Matthew Spady. I'll be leading you on your walk today through the Audubon Park Historic District, and in particular talking about how developers marketed these apartments when they were new in the early 20th century. Before I get started, just a word about Jane's Walk. Most of you probably already know Jane's Walks are free, community-led walking conversations in honor and memory of Jane Jacobs, the activist, visionary, journalist, and author. They take place the first week of May every year. Last year, they were curtailed somewhat because of the coronavirus. This year, they're being done, sponsored again in New York by the Municipal Arts Society, and they are mainly virtual, although there are some that you can download and do a walk yourself. There are also some that are on demand so that you can just go and download or go and watch them online at your own pleasure. So I encourage you all to look at the full list. Since you're here, you know where that is. Look at the full list and join as many walks as you can this week. Again, I'll ask everyone to keep yourself muted during the course of the walk. If you have any questions along the way, please put them in the chat box. I have my chat box open and I will try to answer them as you ask them. Otherwise, we will have a Q&A at the end of the walk. As I said, this is sponsored by the Jane's Walks in New York, is sponsored by the Municipal Art Society. It's a 125-year-old organization that lifts up the voices of the people in the debates that shape New York's built environment and leads the way toward a more livable city from sidewalk to skyline. I always like to recite that exactly as it's written because I think that's a wonderful elevator pitch and really expresses very much what the Municipal Art Society does here in New York City. Here are some of the buildings in the Audubon Park neighborhood. It's in Upper Manhattan. It's named after John James Audubon, the naturalist and the painter. He lived here the last decade of his life. He died in 1851. You can see some of the magnificent apartment buildings we have here in the neighborhood. We're going to be walking by most of these on our walk today. Here are some of the buildings in the Audubon Terrace Museum Complex. This was founded by philanthropist Archer Huntington. It interlocks with the residential Audubon Park Historic District and covers part of what was once Audubon's farm. I won't be focusing on these buildings in particular. However, they are an integral part of the neighborhood, and they were very important back in the early 1900s when these developers were building apartment buildings. They used the Hispanic Society in particular as a selling point for some of their buildings. Now, I'm going to turn off my, if I can get this to cooperate again, I'm going to turn off my video, and I ask all of you to do the same so that we can focus on the slides as we're going through our walk. So again, if I can get up here, there we go. I'm going to stop my video. And again, I ask you to do the same so that we can all focus on these slides. So moving on, in case you're not familiar with the neighborhood where we are, here's a map of Manhattan on the left. You've got the Empire State Building down there in the south. You've got Central Park, and then you move on north to Harlem, Upper Manhattan. And here you can see is where we are, where that red arrow is. On the right, I have a map of the interlocking Audubon Terrace and Audubon Park Historic Districts. They are between West 155th Street and West 158th Street. Let me see if I can get my arrows to come up. There they go. They're between West 155th and West 158th, which was also, those were the boundaries of the historic Audubon Park neighborhood. As I said, it's named after John James Audubon, who lived here the last decade of his life. Let me give you just a brief history of the neighborhood and how it led to the cityscape that we're going to be walking through today. John James Audubon, there on the right, bought 14 acres of land here in 1841, in the fall of 1841. That fall and winter, his younger son, John Woodhouse Audubon, excuse me, and a group of workmen hewed a farm out of those 14 acres, and the family moved there in the spring of 1842. Audubon registered the farm in his wife's name. Her name was Lucy, both for sentimental and practical reasons. The sentimental were that while he was working on the Birds of America, Lucy Audubon had been his mainstay. She had worked as a governess and really helped support him financially as well as emotionally during that period. So in reward or in kind for that, her services and for looking after him, he named the farm after her. He also registered it in her name. It was also practical because by registering the farm in her name, if he went bankrupt, as he had done early in his life, they wouldn't lose the farm. It would be in her name. The sons, Victor and John Woodhouse, called their mother Minnie. That's a Scottish endearment for mother. They picked that up when they were in Scotland completing the Birds of America. And thus they began calling the farm Minnie's land. It was both nominally and figuratively her land. Here are a couple of views of the house that they built. The one on the left is a little bit more realistic. That's a woodcut from 1851. You can see this was built in the Italianate Victorian style, which was popularized in America by Andrew Jackson Davis in the 1840s. On the right, you see a more romanticized version of the house. The composer of this particular lithograph has put John James and Lucy on the porch with their two boys playing in the yard. By the time they moved to Minnie's land, John James and Lucy were middle-aged going on elderly, and their sons were both married. They had been married, their first wives had died, and they were working on or married to their second wives, and they had children. So that's, as I say, a bit of a romanticized picture. The Audubons always had financial problems. The Birds of America had been a huge artistic success, but not very much of a financial one. Those hard times worsened during the 1840s as John James Audubon aged and his health deteriorated. Shortly after he died in 1851, his wife and his sons began dividing the farm into these spacious building lots and constructing houses. Some of them they leased, and some of them they sold. Within a few years, the farm had evolved into Audubon Park, which was a dozen Italianate villas set into the hillside among curving drives, manicured lawns, and ornate gardens. Here you have a map of Minnie's land, of Audubon Park. There on the left, you can see how the houses are facing in various directions. They've got the curving drives through there. There were forest trees and there were gardens. You can also see how the houses all had plenty of light and air around them, plenty of space. They were each on a promontory, or many of them were, on promontories so that they could see over the house that was to the west of them, so that they all had a very good view of the Hudson River and the New Jersey Palisades beyond that. Notice how the property on the opposite side of what is going to become Broadway, that roadway in the middle, 11th Avenue, would eventually become Broadway. It wasn't a street as of yet. And over there, 10th Avenue is present day Amsterdam. But notice between 10th Avenue and 11th, how the land there is being developed very differently. A man named Dennis Harris had bought part of this from Lucy Audubon, part from other people. And as you can see, he was really adhering to the grid. You have the houses that are there on 158th Street, lined up on regular lots, and facing the street, they're also sort of regular sized houses. So again, he was beginning to adhere to the grid. This pattern of Audubon Park being very park-like and the rest of the city growing up in a grid fashion around it continued through the second half of the 19th century and has actually influenced the footprint of the neighborhood even today. So moving on here, the Audubon's real estate scheme didn't really solve their financial problems. They had maintenance on their property, the taxes, the insurance. Finding tenants for these houses they built was not always easy because it was a very fluid society. People were accustomed to moving every year. And so their plans, as I say, did not really solve their financial problems. Victor Audubon died in 1860, and his brother John Woodhouse died in 1862, leaving their mother, their widows, and 13 children between them. Lucy Audubon sold her house, which is the one there on the right, in 1864. Caroline, who was John Woodhouse Audubon's widow, lost hers in foreclosure the same year. Georgiana, who was Victor's widow, remained in Audubon Park until about 1879. At first, none of the property owners in the park had a majority share as the Audubons had had before. However, over the next 2 decades, George Blake Grinnell began slowly accumulating lands and houses so that by the time he died in 1891, he owned about 2/3 of the property in Audubon Park. When his wife died in 1893, she left the property to their 5 surviving children. The children found that owning all this property and these houses was no more lucrative for them than it had been for the Audubons. And so they began developing an exit strategy, a way that they were going to maximize the value of their property. Once they had maximized the value of their property, then they would sell it. One of the ways that they were going to do this was by Riverside Drive, which was being extended from where it ended at Grant's Tomb all the way north to meet a roadway called the Boulevard Lafayette, and then it go all the way around the top of the island in this one long drive. By having an address on Riverside Drive, that was really going to help their property. The other thing that was going to help it would be the New York subway, which was being built in the early 1900s. Construction began in 1900, and the subway opened in November of 1904. It opened here in the Audubon Park neighborhood about a month later. The Grinnells, as I say, were determined that they were going to have the benefit of these 2 public works, and so they worked with their political and social friends to make sure that when Riverside Drive came north, it came across their property, as you can see on that map there, and that when the subway came north, they were going to have a station adjacent to their property. That happened as well. In 1904, they began selling their land. They sold a bit of the the southern portion to Archer Huntington, who began building the Hispanic Society, the first of several museums in what is now known as the Audubon Terrace Museum Complex. And then in 1908, they sold the remainder to developers who quickly covered it with the apartment buildings we're going to see as we begin our walk today. Now, as I move here to the next slide, this is an image, a photograph taken just a few months after the subway opened. This is from May of 1904. You can see dominating the skyline there is the Church of the Intercession. That's its second location. Its third location and present is in Trinity Cemetery at the corner of Broadway and 155th Street. Over there on the left, that open land you see, that is Audubon Park, waiting to be developed. And on the eastern side of Broadway, which is on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see that the lots are empty. There's construction that's going to begin there very soon as well. So this is what the area looked like immediately before that transformation from suburban Audubon Park into the cityscape that we're going to be seeing today. When Audubon Park began its transformation, it was late. Developers had already begun buying property up and down the subway line, even as early as 1900. Once the stops were established, speculative buyers bought up as much property as they could and began to, some of them had the intention of building on it. Others did not have so much the intention of building as they did holding the property and selling it to a developer. So they were speculative buyers. But as I say, the Grinnells didn't sell their property until 1908, which was 4 years after the subway opened. So there was already quite a bit of building going on. And there was a great deal of focus by people who were interested in real estate on Audubon Park and what was going to happen there. One of my favorite articles is that one right there in the center, Audubon Park's Rapid Transformation. This appeared, as you can see, in 1909, and it's about how quickly, once the Grinnells had sold their property, developers came in and covered it with apartment buildings. And of course, I really like the pun there on rapid transit, which was the catalyst for the rapid transformation. Here are some of the pictures or some of the things that developers did. With so many speculative apartment buildings arising at one time, the developers who built these apartment buildings had to figure out a way to get paying tenants. The idea here was that what they would do, they would build an apartment house, buy money to do it, borrow money to do it. They would build the apartment house, and then they would fill it and show a good rent roll so that within a year or 2 years of renting seasons, they could show that it was a profitable building. They could sell it and roll over the money, build another building. And so this is how a lot of the apartment buildings on the Upper West Side and in northern Manhattan and Washington Heights up into Inwood were developed and built in those years following the subway. It was called the subway boom in apartment building. So that was the challenge that they faced. One of the things that they did, of course, was to find amenities, ways that they could make their building more attractive or more interesting than the one that might be next door. One thing they had going in their favor, of course, was just the location itself, because Washington Heights was still very open. There was still trees. Audubon Park, when the buildings were first going up, Audubon Park was there, and that itself was something to look at. I particularly like this ad for the Audubon Park Apartments, which is on Broadway at 156th Street. It adds the charm of country to the city home. So this was one of the elements that developers were using. They also had things like a uniform staff, a grand lobby, a dramatic entrance. Not everybody could live in a mansion on Fifth Avenue. And of course, at this time, there were still mansions on Fifth Avenue, and it was a popular thing to do for people to promenade by them on a Sunday afternoon, say, and just admire these buildings. Well, not everyone had the kind of money to build a mansion on Fifth Avenue, but what these developers did was create apartment buildings that gave you this sense of the luxury that you lived in one of those buildings. So you entered through a grand entrance. You entered into a grandiose, lovely lobby. You had uniformed staff there to welcome you, to take you up in the elevator to your floor and to your apartment. Some of the other amenities they had were things like paneling, as you can see in that dining room there at the Grinnell, enameled woodwork, dumbwaiters, modern kitchens, mail chutes, and switchboards. A lot of these buildings had interior switchboards that could connect one apartment to another when they were new. So let's actually get started on our walk. I've given you that background of what it is that we're going to see and some of the history leading up to this. Let's start our walk here at the corner of Broadway and 155th Street. And remember, from Minnie's land, when the Audubons were here, this was an orchard. There were about 200 fruit trees that would have been spreading in front of us if we were standing here back in the 1840s at some time. This was the northernmost street in Manhattan's grid when the commissioners laid it out in 1811. They had two reasons for that. One was they didn't think the city would spread this far for several hundred years. And the other was they didn't want to encourage land speculation by dividing the property into equal-sized lots and regular gridded streets. They were wrong on both counts, of course. The city had expanded beyond this point well before 100 years was up. And of course, land speculation has always been one of the favorite gambles for people living in Manhattan. When you're on an island, there's a finite amount of land, and the only way to go is either northward, as they were developing northward, or up. And I will remind everyone, if you would keep yourselves on mute during the walk, it will help to have less interruption and more concentration on the slides here. So we're going to start over there at the Audubon Park Apartments. That's the one with the bird mural on the side. That's one of the Audubon murals, by the way. And I'll point out that if you're looking for other walks to do, Lee Hallingby, who is a tour guide here in New York, is leading a Jane's Walk of the Audubon murals. You can do it two ways. You can do it either on demand, or you can join her walk on Saturday. I encourage you to do that. I've taken her walk before, and it is really excellent. And you get to see these spectacular murals that are sponsored by Avi Gittler's Gallery and the Audubon Society. Now, this building, the Audubon Park Apartments, isn't actually in the footprint of the historic Audubon Park, nor is it in the Audubon Park Historic District. However, it was the first of the Beaux Arts apartment buildings built in the neighborhood. So let's go there first. There's a picture of it on the right, how it looked when it was new. You can see some pictures there on the left of how it looks now. This was designed by Schwartz and Gross in collaboration with Bertram Marcus. Schwartz and Gross were prolific apartment house builders, designers in the early 1900s. It's interesting because Andrew Dolkart, in his book on Morningside Heights, points out that the architects like Schwartz and Gross and others we'll see on our walk today were not of the firms like McKim, Mead and White, or Career and Hastings. They were educated in less prestigious architectural offices or went to technical schools. However, they still incorporated these Beaux Arts principles in their architecture, even though they didn't go to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, as many of the leading architects did, but they still incorporated these principles in their buildings, and their buildings are the ones that have actually created a lot of the streetscapes that we see on the Upper West Side and up into Washington Heights. This is an excellent example of that style, and let me just give you a few of the principles, because a lot of the buildings, or all of the buildings actually, we're going to see today, follow these principles. The main principle of the École des Beaux-Arts was that they were studying classical principles, as in Greco-Roman architecture, and they studied the column. The column has a base, it has a shaft, and it has a capital. Translated into a building, and you look at the Audubon Park Apartments there, you have a stone base for 2 stories. Often this was a rusticated stone, that is a rough sort of unfinished looking stone. Then you have brick stories going up above that, and that forms the shaft of the column. And then at the top you have a cornice. In this case, they've made both the top floor and the cornice into a sort of decorative top that mimics the capital of the column. So we have base, we have the shaft of the column, and we have the capital translated into the architecture of the building. Notice that this building has recessed fire escapes. This was a technique that Schwartz and Gross used often. Some people say that they invented it. I'm not sure whether they invented it, but they definitely used it often in their buildings. It gave the appearance on the front that you had balconies rather than a fire escape. It sort of increases the architectural beauty of the front of the building. Unfortunately, it also takes away square footage from the inside. And as I was mentioning earlier, one of the things that speculative builders wanted to do was put as many apartments and people into a building as possible so that they could improve their rent rolls, get them up to a really good level so that they could then sell the building. When this building was new, here's that ad that you saw earlier advertising the prices for the apartments. And do keep in mind, these were prices per year, not per month. They were advertised yearly, although of course people did pay them monthly. But this way you could figure out your yearly budget as you're renting your apartment. And again, that lovely phrase, adds the charm of country to the city home, which I really like that. Several years ago, I noticed the door was open to the Audubon Park apartments, and I went in. I don't normally just walk into other people's buildings any more than I would walk into their houses. But the door was open, and I really did want to see what the lobby looked like. And I took this particular photo. You've got the cord going across the floor there because they were doing some work on it. But you can see here some of the amenities that these developers offered to the tenants in their buildings. You've got the marble facing, for example, you've got the mosaic tile floor. One thing you would not have had is that row of mailboxes over there on the wall. Those are new. When these buildings were new, they all had a staff. The staff accepted the mail, sorted it, and delivered it to the apartments. When I first moved to the Grinnell back in 1998, there was a lady living there who had moved in 1937, and she was a wonderful font of information about how the building had looked then, which was really only a generation away from when the building was new, and she knew people who had moved there when it was new. And she told me that up until World War II, the staff did still take in the mail, and they delivered it to each apartment door twice a day. If you supplied them a basket, they would put it in the basket for you. Now we're going to cross Broadway, and we're going to go back towards 155th Street. We'll just stop and take a look into the Audubon Terrace Museum Complex. We're looking from the eastern side to the western side. This is not the original entrance. Charles Huntington, who designed this, had the original entrance on 156th Street. We'll see that when we get over to that street. But notice how the buildings, you're seeing them from the side, which was not part of the Beaux Arts principle. The Beaux Arts principle would have been to see them straight on in their setting so that you have both the building and its setting all working together. So now let's go on down to the corner, and we're going to start down 155th Street. You can see it's rather steep. It is not nearly as steep as it would have been when the Audubons lived here or when this was suburban Audubon Park. The reason is that when Riverside Drive was built, which is down at the foot of the street, it was built on a retaining wall 40 feet high to keep it on grade, so that the streets, this one, 156 and 157, were all graded to Riverside Drive rather than to the river. If they had been graded to the river, they probably would have passed under Riverside Drive rather than to it. So that's why the street is not nearly as steep as it could have been. If you look at the photo there on the upper left, over at Trinity Cemetery, you get a much better idea of what the neighborhood would have looked like, how it's hilly. You can also see how the street going down, it separates. 155th has two parts, and that goes down at a much steeper grade than the one we're going to be walking down, or that we are walking down now. Notice also how the museums on our right form a street wall that sort of enclose the Audubon Park neighborhood, but also give this really solid wall here that we're walking down. So we're going to go on down to the bottom of the street, and as we get there, we can look back up at the cemetery. When you look up at the cemetery, again, you get a much better idea of what suburban Audubon Park looked like, with the ground falling off in those terraces. Also notice right in the center, that bright pink is a dogwood. There are 4 or 5 dogwoods still left in Trinity Cemetery. These are indigenous to the East Coast and at one time covered Audubon Park. There are written records of how there were so many dogwood there. In the fall, after the leaves and the blossoms fall off, they're berries, which are very popular with birds. Birds love those. And people used to talk about how there were more birds in Audubon Park than elsewhere. It's a little bit sentimental. I don't think that's really true, but of course it would have helped to have had these dogwood to draw the birds to the Audubon Park neighborhood. So when we get to the bottom of the hill, or 155th, we're now on Riverside Drive, and we're looking across at 765 Riverside Drive. This is not one of the earlier apartment buildings, and so we're not going to dwell on it too much. I pointed out because this is where the Audubon homestead sat. I showed you a couple of images of that earlier. It sat here, but 40 feet lower, because as I said, the Riverside Drive retaining wall comes up 40 feet. And the building there, 765 Riverside, is sitting atop a double garage. Um, this building dates to 1932. I'll tell you just a little bit about it since we're looking at it. It dates to 1932. It is not in the Beaux Arts style exactly. However, it does echo that style. The lower floors are set off with a belt course in brick. And then you can see you have, so that would be like the base of the column. And then you have the rows of floors going up, which form the shaft. And then you have that crenellated roof line and the decoration there, which imitates the Capitol. So it's although it's not exactly the Beaux Arts style, it does mirror it, or it does homage to it, as do most of the buildings on that side of Riverside Drive. So what we're going to do now is we're going to walk farther out there on the plaza and look back at these buildings, which are three of the grandest of the Beaux Arts apartment buildings in the Audubon Park Historic District, in the Audubon Park neighborhood. Going from right to left, they are 780 Riverside, the Vauxhall, and then 788, which is Rhinecliff Court, and then 790, which is the Riviera. So now let's look at them in chronological order. And so we're going to take the middle one first. That's Rhinecliff Court, 788 Riverside Drive. This dates to 1910. And like the Audubon Park apartments that we just saw, is by Schwartz and Gross. Notice that this doesn't have any fire escapes on the exterior at all. That's because the buildings were considered to be fireproof. They're a steel construction with gypsum block. Gypsum block is a predecessor to drywall. And it is, although it's not fireproof, it is fire retardant. So that the idea was that if you had a fire, there would be time to get out. Most of the fires that I have known about in my nearly 30 years, or actually more than 30 years now, in the Audubon Park neighborhood, in these older buildings, have been confined to the apartment as long as the doors weren't open so it could spread to another. So there is a certain amount of fireproofness about them. This particular building, Rhinecliff Court, appeared in a book called The World's New York Apartment House Album. This was a wish book that realtors had that they could show to people who wanted to rent apartments. There were about 100 different apartments that had a picture, buildings that had a picture of them, a floor plan, and then all of these amenities that were selling points. I can't go through all of them because there's so many there, but I will mention just a couple. There's a magnificent entry hall, marble and mosaic, as we saw at the Audubon Park. Unusually large rooms, 1 to 3 baths, views of the river, views of the Hispanic Society, ventilation on all sides. Some of the apartments had separate entrances for servants, wainscoting in the dining room, modern bathrooms and kitchens, and the elevators would be running continuously day and night. Now, remember, these were not automatic elevators that you stepped in and pushed a button. They were run by staff, which meant that you had staff around the clock. Notice there on the upper left is a ad which appeared in the New York Herald when this building was new. And of course, they couldn't include all of those amenities on it, but they do have some of the amenities, just a few of them listed there, as well as the prices. On the walk earlier this week, someone asked me, and I didn't know, what were the salaries of people that would have been comparable, who would be living in these buildings. And someone kindly looked it up and popped it into the chat window that regular jobs for middle-class professional people ranged from about $2,000 to $2,500 a year. And so you can see that in some cases, that would have been a third of your income. In some cases, it would have been more. And so the people who lived in those apartments may have been maybe something like a doctor or a lawyer that had a more flexible sort of income. And down there at the bottom is the entrance to this building, the entrance to Rhinecleft Court, which again, this one is entered in a courtyard, and you can see has a very nice surround to the door there. On either side, you can see a door. Those go into duplex apartments. These were often advertised as suitable for a doctor or a dentist, the idea being that the doctor or dentist could have his office on the first floor, and then the family could live on the second floor. And because they had these outside entrances, you didn't have to go into the building through the lobby to get to the doctor or the dentist. This is the Riviera, which is at 790 Riverside Drive. It covers the entire block front of Riverside Drive between 156th and 157th Streets. It's so large, it's really hard to get away from it to get a really good photograph of the entire building. When it was built, it was the largest apartment house, not only in Washington Heights, but in New York City. One of the ads here advertised that it had public rooms that were entirely apart from the bedrooms. This was a major concern for people who were moving from vertical living in row houses into horizontal living in apartment buildings. They really were worried about, would it be private enough? In a row house, of course, you often had the kitchen and the sort of service areas in the basement. Then you had your parlor floor, which often usually had the dining room on it. Then above that, you had the bedroom floors. And so you had all of your zones separated by floors. In an apartment, this wasn't as easy to do. And this was a challenge for those apartment house architects, was how to articulate the rooms so that you had that same amount of privacy. Often what they did, this happened, for example, at the Audubon Park apartments, was that you would enter and go down a long hall. The reason was you were passing the bedrooms and you're passing the kitchen and the butler's pantry, the maid's room, all of those things, so that you could get to the living room and the dining room, which were facing the street, because that entry was on the inside of the building. At the Riviera, Rouse and Goldstone, I forgot to mention the architects, this dates to 1911, it's Rouse and Goldstone. When they designed the Riviera, they were a little bit more creative, and they had some of the bedrooms on the outside and some of the public rooms on the inside, so that you, towards the inside of the building, but because they had all of those deep courtyards, you still had light, air, and ventilation. Another of the early amenities there at the Riviera was that they had a laundry and steam drying rooms on the roof. And every butler's pantry, they advertised, was equipped with an ice box. So now let's move on. Oh, before we do, this is the original entrance, the Riverside Drive entrance of the Riviera. And in the inset there, you see the fountain with the lion's head to the left as you would go in. This is where, when the building was new, there was a cab stand actually outside this entrance for the neighborhood. And people could get out and walk right into the building. Now it's been rearranged somewhat so that the tenants are more likely to use the 157th Street entrance, which is there on the left. That's where the porter stand is, so that when you're visiting the building, you can be announced to the tenants who are there. And the Riviera has a quite glamorous and gorgeous lobby. And like many of the other buildings, when it was new, the staff would, of course, take you up to your floor in the elevator. So now let's move to the Vauxhall, which is 780 Riverside Drive. This is where I lived when I first moved to the neighborhood back in 1987, before my partner and I bought an apartment at the Grinnell around the corner. And I lived in that top floor there, where you see, second to the top floor, where you see those nice balconies, and on the side looking south. So we had the spectacular view of the cemetery and of the whole city there below us. This building is by the Blum brothers, George and Edward Blum, and it dates to 1914. This was the last of the Beaux Arts apartment houses built in this neighborhood. The ad that you see there for the Vauxhall is from November 11th, 1914, which was the first renting season for this building. And as you can see, again, notice those Beaux Arts techniques. You've got the base which is a smooth stone in this case. And then you've got the multiple floors going up in brick, and then you have that decorative cornice at the top. Notice the inlaid brickwork there on the outside of the building. And then when you go into the lobby, there at the bottom, the inset, you see the fireplace in the lobby repeats that sort of motif. So they've taken that sort of arts and craft look from the outside into the inside. Again, this is a really lovely, spacious, bright lobby. Notice how the apartments that are off of the lobby are entered by steps, which sets them off just slightly from the lobby itself. Has that beautiful tile floor. Next to the door, you see those are the main doors we're looking at there in the photograph. And next to that, you can see a mirror with a table. And right beyond that, you can see a little bit of a door that went to the switchboard room. The room is still there. Switchboard is long gone, but that's where the switchboard was that you could use to call back and forth inside the building. I've never been quite clear whether you had to use that switchboard to get outside of the building or not. But I do know that the switchboard was mainly for back and forth among apartments in the building. Here in the center of Riverside Drive at the foot of 156th Street is the jewel of the neighborhood. This is what we call the Oval Park. It is a viewing park. That is, it's not open for people just to go in. The Riverside Oval Association, which is organized and run by my neighbor Vivian Ducat and Steve Simon. Vivian is at the Riviera and Steve is at 765, the building we saw earlier. They raise all of the money to look after it. However, our neighborhood volunteers really look after it. And in there, the other day when I took this photo, is Christina Reed, who is the person who's done all of the landscaping, and I believe working with her is Bruce Robertson, who's on our call right now. And they keep this looking beautiful. And as I say, it's the gem of the neighborhood, particularly for all of these apartment buildings surrounding it that look down on that park. Those trees there are London plane trees, and they date back to about the 1920s. So now we're going to turn up 156th Street. We're going to walk by the Riviera there, turn up 156th. And on our left, we have three apartment buildings, the Cortez, the Velasquez, and the Goya. These all have Spanish names because when they were new, they were facing the Hispanic Society building. And so the developer capitalized on that and gave them all Spanish names to accommodate that. Here is the Cortez, which was designed by Neville and Bagg. It's from 1909. This building was distinguished by there being only two apartments on a floor, an 8-room and a 9-room. The 8-room had 2 baths, the 9 had 3, which suggests that the difference in rooms was another bedroom and bath. This, in the ad, they talk about the quiet exclusiveness of the neighborhood, and that it was a steel, concrete, and brick construction. Again, it was considered fireproof. This was really important, both in these 6-story buildings and particularly in those taller 10 and 11-story buildings on Riverside Drive to assure people that the building was fireproof. And again, you can see there are no fire escapes on the front of the building in this particular case. Now, moving on up the street, we have the twin buildings, the Goya and the Velasquez. They were both designed by Denby and Knut, and they date to 1910. The entrance that we see up there is the Goya. The lobby is the Velasquez. So it's a combination of those two buildings we're looking at. When you come into the lobby, on your right is that niche where probably there was at one time a statue of some sort, or perhaps a vase for flowers. Then you walk into this really lovely, wide, long lobby. Notice the coffered ceiling. You've also, again, got the mosaic floor, and you've got the inlaid marble on the sides. One of the things that I really like about this lobby is when you come in, to the left, you have apartment doors. Then there is a large courtyard and 2 windows onto the lobby so that you have lots of light and air that comes in. when the windows are open, of course. When you walk straight in front of you from those doors, you come to the elevator. If you turn around the corner, there's a staircase. Here's another view of it, and you can see the light coming in those windows reflecting off of that beautiful marble, inlaid marble, and the mosaic floor. And here are two ads for, one is for the Velasquez and the Goya, the other's for the Velasquez. The one for the Velasquez is the earlier of the two, although most often, from the time they were built in 1910 until well into the 20s, the same person owned them and often would advertise them together, the Velasquez Goya, as a pair. Directly across the street from these two buildings is the Church of Our Lady of Esperanza, which was designed by Charles Huntington, who, as I mentioned earlier, designed most of the museums in the Audubon Terrace Museum complex. This was from, I think it was about 1908 that it opened. This is not the original entrance, however, or the original facade. This is what it originally looked like. This is what Charles Huntington designed. You had that steps coming up from the street level, then you had that wide porch, and you entered through that portico into the church on the second floor. It was redesigned in 1924 by Lawrence White, who was son of Stanford White of McKim, Mead and White. The church needed more space, and so they wanted to come forward towards the street. In that earlier design, if you notice, it's off of the street somewhat. You have the stairs at the sort of at the sidewalk line, but the church itself is set back. Now the church, the whole facade is right on the sidewalk line. You enter through the doors there, and there's an elevator and steps that takes you to the second floor, where the sanctuary of the church actually is. This was the first purpose-built church for Spanish people in New York City. And it was quite well known because the ambassador, the Spanish ambassador's wife, took a great interest in it, helped raise funds for it, helped get groups together to support it. When it was new and when it was open, the King of Spain sent a chandelier, a gilt chandelier that still hangs just behind those windows that you see there on the second floor. So this was the church that would have sat across from the Velasquez, Goya, and Cortez, and still does today. And let me move beyond there. Next to the church is a piece of undeveloped land. This is Manhattan schist. It's the only undeveloped piece of land in the Audubon Park neighborhood. And it's really a reminder of our many layers of history. This schist, this Manhattan schist, was here when the Lenape people, the Native American tribe, were living here. They were a peripatetic people, and they were usually here in the summer, spring, summer, and fall months. They used the heights as hunting grounds, and they used the Hudson River as a fishing ground. So it was here when the Lenape were here, when the colonial settlers came up onto the heights and displaced them and began farming here. It was here when the Audubons were, when the Audubon Park neighborhood was, and it's again here today. So we had this sort of link to our history right in our midst with this remaining piece of Manhattan schist. Now, as we walk up the street, we've got the Cortez, Goya, Velasquez here on our left, and across from us, we have the north building of the Hispanic Society. This is rather a grim facade, looks a little bit like a penitentiary. This is not what the Goya, Velasquez, and Cortez residents saw when they first moved into these buildings in the 1910 and 1911. What they saw instead was this beautiful fence with the wrought iron fence set in there in the stone. The gates, you could walk up the steps to a plaza. It's split and you walk up to another plaza, and there's the Hispanic Society. It must have been quite a spectacular view from their front windows to look over and see this. And as museums were added on either side of the Hispanic Society there. They were built in that same Beaux Arts style, and to complement it, you had this sort of harmonious wall of museums there. This was there until the late 1920s, when that other building, which I just was showing you, the North Building was built. The Hispanic Society needed more space, and so this is where they put their North Building. It closed off that entrance, unfortunately, but again, they did need the space. But it gives you an idea of the architect's original conception of what this museum complex really should have looked like. So now we're going to walk up to the corner of 156th Street and Broadway. And we come to twin buildings, Hispania Hall, which is on 156th Street, and Audubon Hall, which is on 157th. We're actually north of 157th looking back. And the other day, someone asked, is this actually curved, or is that just the photograph? It's curved. The front of this building is curved to accommodate Broadway. This actually was originally the entrance to the Boulevard Lafayette. There was a large plaza here, and it curved around. And so when George Fred Pelham designed these buildings, which were erected and opened in 1909, he curved them to accommodate that curve in the street. These two buildings appeared in another of those wish books. This one was called The Supplement to Apartment Houses of the Metropolis. And it, again, lists all of their amenities, quite a few of them, as you can see up there. And again, has a floor plan. These two buildings, when they were new, unlike the Audubon Park apartments across the street, these buildings did have commerce on the first floor. There was accommodation for a shop in each one. Those have now expanded somewhat so that we have more. And again, the Audubon Park apartments, which originally had apartments on the first floor, now have stores across the front as well. So each of these buildings was entered on the side street rather than on the front. But notice how they also have those recessed fire escapes to give that flatter look to the front of the building. Some of the amenities that you had here were, again, that country combined with city, ventilation, servants' rooms. Servants' rooms were really important in all of these buildings because many of the people who were moving into them, the target audience, the sort of solidly middle class, did have a servant. And on the initial census records in 1915, which is when the New York State used to do a census on the fives. And so we have one from 1915 and 1925. And you could still see, as late as 1925, that many of the people still had a servant in their household using these rooms. However, by 1930 and certainly by 1940, most of those rooms were occupied either by a family member or sometimes rented out to a boarder or to a lodger. So the use of these rooms changed over time, but initially it was very important to have a servant's room because many of these people did have a maid. Another of the amenities here was the dining rooms were not only paneled, but they had a beamed ceiling and a Dutch shelf at the top of the panel. And as you see there at the bottom, there is an advertisement for Hispania Hall, which is the one that faced the Hispanic Society building. So now we're going to turn and we're going to move down 157th. Oh, but I see I have a question here. Someone asked, in front of one of the buildings on Edward Morgan Place between 156 and 157th, the curved building has a fence with the Star of David. That's correct. And let me go back. That is Hispania Hall, which is on the 156th Street side. And there's a very interesting fence in front of it, which does have the Star of David in the top. It doesn't appear to have been original, as you can see from these photographs that were in this apartment house wish book. There wasn't a fence there. So that must have been added later. But it's also a reminder that in the 1930s, when Jews were fleeing Germany and Austria, many of them who came to New York moved to Washington Heights. into these very buildings that we're looking at. Not as many as moved across Broadway. If you look at the census records again, you can see that in 1940 census, there is a column for where somebody lived 5 years earlier. And so you can get a sense of who the new people in the neighborhood were. The apartments on the eastern side of Broadway were slightly less expensive than those here in the Audubon Park neighborhood. So although you see some of the new families that had come from Germany and Austria and other European countries in those years, there weren't nearly as many as across the street. Anyway, this area had such a large group of Jewish refugees who opened synagogues and restaurants and other sort of social clubs that it was called Frankfurt on the Hudson. And there's actually a book, Frankfurt on the Hudson. If you can find a copy, it's not, I don't think it's in print now, but if you can find a copy, it's a really wonderful book about that period with lots of statistics sort of interspersed with the story. It's a really wonderful book. So now we're going to go and thank you to the person for the question, and anyone else, if you do have a question as I'm going along, please do drop them in the chat and I will try to answer them as we're walking along here. So we're now going to go down 157th Street. On the left there, we have the Hortense Arms apartment building, which is one of my favorite in the entire Audubon Park neighborhood. I really like that Palladian style of architecture, and I particularly like what the architects Neville and Bagg, and this building dates to 1909, what they did with the entrance. You see, it's really just a one-story doorway, but they've taken those pilasters up to the top of the second floor, and then they've got an architrave on top of those, and on top of that, you've got a window with a pediment. So the doorway itself, the entrance, seems to go up for 3 stories. Then they take that pedimented window and repeat it down the block. If you see there in the picture there on the left, that pediment then points up towards what I think is probably a copper, hammered copper cornice there at the top. So everything sort of takes your eye up to the top of the building. The only problem with this building that I've ever found is that you can't get far enough away from it to really get a good view of the entire building because it's built on a side street. The Grinnell, the third wall, the Grinnell is a triangle, and what we consider the back of it is right across the street there. So you can't really get an angle so that you can get far enough away from the building to see it. Interesting little fact about this building, the owner was a woman named Sarah Harris. She lived down on the Upper West Side, and Neville and Bagg had actually designed her row house, and then she got them to design this apartment house. She liked it so much that she moved in the next year herself, moved her family in. As we're going farther down the street, we come to the Kanawha Court. This has a deeply recessed entrance to it. This again is in the Beaux Arts style in that tripartite vertical construction. This is by Joseph Cocker, and it dates to 1909. All of the apartment buildings, as you've noticed as we've gone along, had names, and the names were part of the marketing for the apartments. Many of the names for apartment buildings in this era came from Sir Walter Scott. Lots of place names that came out of Sir Walter Scott. You know, the Riviera is probably because it has that wonderful river view. Vauxhall, which was one of the earlier ones we saw, is the Vauxhall Gardens in pleasure gardens in England. Let's see, what others do we have? Oh yeah, Rhinecliff Court. There's a Rhinecliff up the Hudson River, which was is a community there. Kanawha, the only reference I've ever been able to find for Kanawha is the Kanawha River, which is in West Virginia. That appears to be a Native American name, and it's the name of that river. Exactly why they gave it to this apartment building, I've never really been able to sort out. So now we're back on Riverside Drive at 157th Street. Straight ahead of us is the wedding cake building, the Sutherland, and there to our right is the Grinnell. These are the last 2 buildings on our walk. So let's go up and look at the Sutherland first. This is designed by Emery Roth. It dates to 1910. And again, it advertised things like its views and its access to the subway. They also mentioned that it's in the Audubon Park section. I guess that's fair. It wasn't really inside what had been Audubon Park. It was across the street, but I guess saying it in the Audubon section is fair. You know, neighborhoods in New York, as everywhere, are defined by two things: who's in and who's out. And the people who are in, of course, are interested in identifying the neighborhood to be exclusive inside, and those who are out identify it or describe it so that they are inside. But again, we won't quibble. This was in the vicinity of Audubon Park. If you've ever read The Great Gatsby, there's a scene in The Great Gatsby where Myrtle Wilson takes a taxi across Central Park and comes up the west side to 158th Street. The cab stops, and Fitzgerald describes it as the cab stopped at one slice in a long white cake of apartment houses. And then Myrtle Wilson gets out and she sort of looks around the neighborhood, gathers her dog and her packages, and haughtily goes inside. People who live in the neighborhood like to think that the building that Fitzgerald was referencing was the Sutherland, unless, of course, you live across the street at the Grinnell. The people at Grinnell like to think it was there. So let's go look at the Grinnell. It's directly across the street on the corner of Riverside Drive and 158th, across from the Sutherland, that is. It's a large triangular building. You can see there at the bottom a floor plan of the apartments. One thing that is unique about the Grinnell is that those apartments have never been subdivided. In many of the buildings around the neighborhood, they were divided. In some of them, they were divided and then put back together in different configurations. At the Grinnell, though, we do have original apartments, or the original outline. People have changed the configuration inside, but the footprint of the apartment has remained pretty much the same. Again, you see this, the page from the World Apartment House album with all of the many amenities at the Grinnell. One thing that they were really keen on was that all of the rooms were outside rooms. That is, they either faced one of the three streets surrounding the Grinnell, or they faced the courtyard, so that you had this light and air which could flow through your apartment. Very important aspects of selling these apartments. They were also advertised as having all of the apartments having a foyer. The larger ones had butler's pantries. The rooms were well apportioned and carefully grouped. Again, that idea of articulating the rooms for the maximum privacy. They also mentioned there are three duplexes, which the Grinnell still does have these three duplexes. The reason for those is that, as you see the doorway there on Riverside Drive, which is the one facing us, and then you can see to the side, there's another double doorway. Those are both 2 stories high. So they broke into 2 apartment lines. If you're not familiar with living in an apartment, what an apartment line is, that's when you have the apartments on top of each other, so that you have the same design floor after floor after floor. You have your living spaces on top of each other, your sleeping spaces, your bathrooms, you know, the ones with plumbing, bathrooms, and kitchens, so that you have this easily have all the plumbing in line. Sorry, I got stumbled on that. You got the plumbing in line, plus you have rooms such as if you're going to bed in one apartment, you don't have to worry about the noise from people in their living room in the other apartment. But since these 2 entrances interrupted those apartment lines, Schwartz and Gross, and I don't think I mentioned that they designed this building, Schwartz and Gross took those leftover pieces and made these duplex apartments. And this building dates to 1911. Oh, I have a question here. Is there living space at the top of the Grinnell in the towers? No, there isn't. Those are water towers. And the 2 that you can see, the one on the corner closest to us and the one going off towards the left, still have water tanks in them. The one on the far end, which would be on our right, doesn't have any signs of ever having had a water tower in it. The roof of the Grinnell is quite large, as you can see from that floor plan, how large it must be. In the last few years, our board, we have a co-op board at the Grinnell, have installed solar panels on part of the roof and a roof deck on another part. So they've really made a nice use of it. You remember I told you or mentioned earlier that when I first moved to the Grinnell, there was a woman who had lived there, moved there in 1937 when she was a teenager. And she told me that the earlier residents had told her, so this is secondhand, third-hand information, had told her that in the early days, the management company, to help get people to move to the Grinnell, gave dances on the roof with a full orchestra in the spring and the summer. Must have been quite grand, although I can't imagine that was very good for the roof. So no, we don't, no one ever lived in those. One of the early ads though, something else about our roof, is after, in that first renting season, 1911, after all of the apartments had been rented, one of the ads mentioned that there was space for an artist studio on the roof, which they probably meant one or more of these water towers. But as I was mentioning earlier about the duplexes, one of the things that the ad here says is they have all of the pleasing aspects of a private house. And that really is true. I'm lucky enough to live in one of those duplexes. And when you enter it and have a staircase there, a little foyer and a staircase, you really do feel like you're in a house somewhere rather than in an apartment building. In the center of the Grinnell is a beautiful courtyard. This was taken at Christmas, obviously, with the Christmas tree there. The planter is normally planted. At the time, we had just finished, our co-op board had just finished a huge project of taking up the entire floor, which sits on top of the boiler room, replacing or repairing the underpinnings of it. In some places, the steel girders had to be sistered because they were so old and dating back to 1911, they'd never been replaced. They had some rust. So all that was done. Then this new floor was put back and the planter was rebuilt. And now it has been refilled with soil and is planted again. But this gives you an idea of that central courtyard, those double-story entrances. You can see some stained glass windows. Those are in the hallways over on what is the east side. In the lower photograph here on the right, you can see the entrance to the west side, and there at the top, you see the entrance to the Grinnell with the Sutherland beyond. Here is going into the two lobbies. The one on the left is the east lobby. The one on the right is the west lobby. See where the mailboxes are? On both of those, again, they would not have been there originally. They were added later. But here in the east lobby, between those two columns, was most likely a counter. And behind this counter, on the portion where we sort of feel like we're standing at the moment, is where the staff would have been. So they could have seen people come in. If they were tenants, they would have helped them with their parcels, taken them up in the elevator. If they were guests, they would have asked who they were coming to visit and used that intra-house phone system to call and let the person know they had a guest. And the same is true there in the west lobby, where those mailboxes are, is where there would have been a counter for the staff. If you've ever seen the movie Gloria with Gina Rowlands, lots of it, large portions were filmed here at the Grinnell, and you can see the original floor, which was a mosaic tile floor, much like we've seen in some of the other buildings. There was a lot of heaving on the floors a couple of decades ago, and when they replaced them, rather than replace them with that mosaic, they replaced them with this marble. Anyway, Gina Rowlands comes down these stairs here in this picture on the right, comes down the stairs and looks out into the courtyard and realizes the mafia is there, and she ducks around with the little boy she's helping to protect. She ducks around where those mailboxes are and goes out the back door. Anyway, it's a wonderful movie, and it's great fun to see the Grinnell, what it looked like back in 1979 when that film was being made. That brings us to the end of our walk. Here's another view of the Grinnell, an aerial view taken from the Sutherland. Again, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat box. I'll mention that there's a group called the Upper Riverside Residents Alliance that is trying to expand the Audubon Park Historic District from that yellow area you see down there at the bottom to include all of that pink area. It would more than double in size. If you're interested in learning more about that or more about the neighborhood north of us, check out saveriverside.org. I'll also mention that I've written a book that was published about the neighborhood, Audubon Park, called The Neighborhood Manhattan Forgot, Audubon Park and the Families Who Shaped It. Fordham just published this last September. You can get it from Fordham, your local bookseller, or from an online vendor. And I see, have a question here. What books about this neighborhood do I recommend? Well, I confess I recommend mine. There's also a really super book that came out maybe 10 years ago by Robert Schneider, who is now the official borough historian for Manhattan. His book is called Crossing Broadway. And it's not just about this neighborhood, but it's about all of Washington Heights, particularly Washington Heights in the second half of the 20th century. Really excellent. There's also, let me think, there's Reginald Pelham Bolton's book about Washington Heights, which actually dates to the 1920s, but it's a very thorough history. It's very difficult to find because it was a small publication run, but you can still find it on Amazon every now and then, and American Book Exchange, abe.com. You can find it those two places. So that, as I say, is the end of the walk. Any questions that anyone else has? I see a couple. The title of Bolton's book is Washington Heights, and then it has a colon and a subtitle. But the main, if you look for Washington Heights and Bolton, B-O-L-T-O-N, you'll be able to find it. And let me just look if I have any other questions. I'm going to scroll back up here in the chat just for a minute. I don't see any others. So I will thank you all for joining. And I will again suggest to you, please don't forget that there are many other Jane's Walks for the rest of this week, all the way through the weekend. So please do check them out and take other walks. And again, thank you and goodbye.